I want to talk about this paper, which is joint work with Annemie, who is sitting there. And let me do the obvious joke that Annemie is going to answer all the hard questions. And this is joint work that we're doing. I mean, we're working on that this week, so I thought it was nice to talk about it at this occasion. This is work on well-being measurement and on how to make well-being comparisons. In terms of motivation, and Richard already talked a little bit about that, I'm working at the Center for Social Policy in Antwerp. So that's a center where we are looking at what is the impact of policies on the distribution. And if you're interested in that, of course, what you need is a tool to make interpersonal comparisons, right? Because many policies, what they do is they generate gains for some people and losses for others. So what you need is to have a tool that allows you to make interpersonal comparisons. Other, I mean, in the literature, I mean, I think now it has become quite well established to argue that well-being is a multidimensional notion. I mean, some of you might know that there was this famous Stiglitz SEND-V2C report that argued that if you want to talk about well-being, we have to see that as a multidimensional notion. You see immediately, if you want to make interpersonal well-being comparisons and you want to acknowledge that well-being is multidimensional, things become complicated. Because you might be better off in one dimension and I might be better off in another one. How to do that? Right? Third level of complication is the fact that different people might have different opinions about what is important in life. Some people might care more about some dimensions, other people might care more about other dimensions. And we would like to have a toolbox that allows us to take this heterogeneity in preferences, as we will call that, into account. And moreover, in this paper, we also want to take into account, or at least allow that people's preferences about what is important in life might be incomplete. And I will be very precise about what I'm talking about later on. So this is a bit like a broad research agenda that I'm working on with several co-authors. You might know Mark Verbeek, who was a Lachman Fellow a couple of years ago, and Erik Skogaard, who is often visiting here as well. And that's a broad question for that research agenda, is how can we make interpersonal well-being comparisons in such a multidimensional world where people have different preferences? Okay, so that's the kind of questions that I want to talk about, that I'm investigating in my broader research, and what I want to do in this paper, and what I want to talk about tonight is in fact about three things. So first, what we want to present is a criterion to make these interpersonal well-being comparisons. And that criterion, we will call that the nested contours criterion. And the intuition behind the criterion is very simple. Okay, let me first say a little bit about the intuition, and then I will be more precise later on in my talk. So what's the intuition? I mean, in a multidimensional framework, you have your preferences, right? I can represent that by an indifference curve. I'm going to say that you are better off than me if your indifference curve is everywhere above my indifference curve. Okay, so if our indifference curves are not crossing and yours is above mine, then I'm saying that you're better off than me. Okay, that's what this nested contours. I mean, I will be more precise later on, but that's the main idea of this criterion. A second point. So let me take one step back. If you say, look, if I take such a criterion, of course I cannot rank all people. Because if your indifference curve and my indifference curve cross somewhere, I mean, I cannot say anything. I cannot rank you and me. Okay? So what was the question? And that was basically the starting point for the research project of Annemie and I, is thinking, okay, but how many people can we actually rank with such a criterion? I mean, how powerful is that in real life? If I just take two people from the street, what's the probability that I can rank them? Okay, that's a question for this paper. Of course, if you want to operationalize it, if I really want to take two people from the street and say, I mean, I can rank them yes or no with this criterion, I need to be able to draw their indifference curves. And as an economist, it was a bit of a surprise for us that, I mean, I'm teaching about indifference curves in my second class, but I don't have good tools about drawing, good tools to draw indifference curves as an economist. we in fact don't have much practical tools. So Annemie and I, we started to think about it, and we came up with a method that we think is quite applicable and that we can use to draw indifference curves of people. Okay? So that's what we will call an adaptive bisectional dichotomous choice, ABDC. Okay? And I will talk you through why I mean it's called like that. Okay, so that's for later. So that's what we're going to do. And then in the third step, we're going to use real-world data from the US that we have collected a couple of weeks ago, and we're going to take this real-world data, and I'm going to tell you how many people we can compare. Okay? So then we're going to apply this machine and see how effective it is in reality. That's what I want to do, and I want to spend, let's say, 1/3 of my time on each of these steps. And this is the outline of my talk, and please interrupt me if I go too slow, too fast, and losing jargon, or especially when I'm sloppy on the philosophical details, because that's why I wanted to present this paper here, or on the decision theoretical aspects of things. So I first want to talk about individual preferences. Yes?
We're thinking about the difference curves like you have health and income or something.
Yes,
right? Okay.
precisely.
Yeah.
Health and consumption, that will, I mean, in the theory, there can be many different things, but when we're going to apply it, it's money and health. Okay?
It's a good idea to have some sort of independence between the dimensions. And if you take consumption and health, I'm not going to enjoy my dinner nearly as much if I've got a stomach bug.
Yes. So, but that's precisely what we want to take into account, right? The extent to which people who are suffering from low income are also suffering from low health. So that's precisely why we want to take this kind of dimension into account to see, I mean, are these the same people who we are identifying as the worst of? Okay, so I not necessarily want these two things to be independent. Rather, what I would want from a, let's say, well-being perspective is that the philosophers, you guys, tell me what are the dimensions of life that we want to take into account. Or if I'm a more liberal person, I allow people themselves to tell me what are the important aspects of life. That's in fact much more in the logic of what we will do. But I will talk about that later on. Yes?
But the difference curves are money on the one hand, and the other is like can be one of the dimensions. So then in one dimension it might be that they don't cross for two people, but in another dimension they will cross.
Sure,
okay.
Sure, yes. I mean, I will show you in different curves many more. And in fact, it should not be necessarily money and something else. This can all be something else and something else. In fact, when I talk about the theory, this will be an n-dimensional vector with many something else's, I mean, as anything as you want. Okay.
So, but is the concept of health not in itself multidimensional?
Sure, absolutely. And I will say a little bit about that as well. Especially when we come here, when we have to apply it. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about individual preferences, then about this criterion of nested contours. We will be much more precise about that. Then about how are we going to draw these contours, and I'm going to present you some data from our United States example. Okay, so individuals, they are described, so they have an outcome vector, and that captures these n dimensions of life. Okay, so this little l, this is a vector, and it captures your outcome in each of the dimensions of life that we are considering to be important. In our empirical application, m will be 2, and this will be consumption and health. But in the theory, now this is, I mean, that's entirely up to you. Okay? We are assuming, and this will be useful later on, we are assuming that our space is in fact bounded. So there's an upper limit on consumption and an upper limit on health. I will talk you, when we come to the points where that really kicks in, I will convert you to that.
They have the same upper bound. That can't be necessary, right? That doesn't really matter, I suppose.
Yes, it will matter when we move to the empirical application. Okay, so, but I will talk you through at that point. So, that's the outcome vector. That describes the outcome of each person. So, a person is indexed with I. And, of course, I mean, I told you that I want to respect the preferences, what people think important, what is important in life for them. So, each of the persons also has a preference relation. How does this preference relation look like? Well, let's assume it is it's asymmetric and transitive. Transitive will be important. Okay, so it's a transitive preference relation. That's what we're going to use later on. Okay? Note, preferences are not necessarily complete. Okay? In fact, this can be backed up, for instance, by behavioral economics insights. I mean, for instance, Salant and Rubinstein in a Restart paper, but how they define preferences, and which will be very consistent with what we're going to do later on. They say, well, Mr. I prefers this bundle over that, if and only if he's given the choice between this pair, right? This is his choice function, right? Then he chooses L, okay, under a particular frame. Okay, and that's why it is an extended choice function, because here the possible frame enters. Okay, so what is such a frame? Such a frame is something which does not belong to the description of the lives, but which might affect your choice. For instance, you might have a preference when it rains and a preference when the sun shines. Okay, so then when it rains is one particular F, and when the sun shines is another F. Okay? And we say people only make an unambiguous choice for a particular life when they choose that under all frames. Okay, so when a life is better both when the sun shines and when it rains, then we say that you unambiguously choose a particular life over another one. And you see that this not necessarily is complete.
So a frame is something that you don't have preferences over, but affects the preferences that you do.
Exactly. Exactly. So, for instance, there's a famous paper by Dan Ariely and co-authors who show that the way in which the willingness to pay question, so they have a bottle of wine, a fancy bottle of wine, Buxton wine from a very good year, right? And they ask people, first, what is your social security number, Richard? Richard says his social security number, they take the last 2 digits of Richard's social security number, and then they ask you, is your willingness to pay for this bottle of wine higher or lower than your social security number? And then they ask Richard, what is your willingness to pay? And it turns out that this social security number affects to a large extent what is your willingness to pay. So that would be an example of a frame. Okay, it's totally irrelevant, but it affects your choice. Okay? What else do we assume upon the preferences? We assume that it is monotonic, so meaning that more is better. And here it might already be useful that it is bounded, right? Because there is no satiation kicking in. We stay in the area where indeed more is better. Okay?
So the I refers to
an individual.
An individual.
Sorry, yes. Okay, so we assume that preferences are monotone, and then a slightly more controversial assumption is that we at some point can also assume that preferences are convex, meaning that you prefer mixtures over more extreme bundles. Okay? Convexity, we don't necessarily need it. Monotonicity, we need it in our machinery. Convexity, we don't necessarily need it, so I'm always going to give you results with and without convexity. Of course, we will be able to say more when you impose convexity. A reason why you might not like convexity is because it implies that you can take mixtures. Okay? And if things are measured on an ordinal scale, a mixture makes no sense. So if you think that health, for instance, is measured on an ordinal scale and not a cardinal scale, then it makes no sense to talk about mixtures. Okay? And then you should not impose convexity. Okay? So, given all that, I need to define an upper contour and a lower contour. That's a better dance set and a worse dance set. So these are all the points that you would unambiguously choose over your own bundle. It's upper contour, and this is the lower contour. That's all the points over which, all the points that in an unambiguous choice you would choose your own bundle over. Okay, that's clear? So that's under all preferences.
Can you specify choose from what subset?
From the 2.
Just from the 2.
Yeah, from the 2. That's how we define P is if you choose from the 2.
Preference from a pair.
Exactly, exactly. Okay, so that is an upper contour, a lower contour, a better dance set and a worse dance set. Remember, preferences are not necessarily complete. That means that there is also a non-comparable set. There is something, there is some part of the space which is not necessarily belong to the upper contour, neither to the lower contour. That's non-comparable. This is the area where the preference really matters. Sorry, the frame really matters for you. Okay? I'm also going to define extended upper contours and extended lower contours. That's an upper contour together with a non-comparable set. Or the complement of the lower contour. If things start getting a little bit blurry, here is an example. So this is a person, okay, a person in the consumption held space. And let's say that this is his indifference curve when it rains, and this is the indifference curve when the sun shines. So this is the upper contour until here. Okay, this is the lower contour. These two areas are the non-comparable sets, and the gray area is the extended upper contour, and the other gray area is the extended lower contour. Okay? That's the setting. Okay? Now we move to the question, how can we make interpersonal comparisons in this framework? What do we want to do? We want to make interpersonal well-being comparisons. We want to compare Mr. I and Mr. J. So what we want to do is we want to make statements like this, and obviously what we need is we need to compare pairs, which are bundles, outcome bundles, and preferences together. Okay, so that's what describes Mr. I's outcomes and his preferences, and that's am I going to compare between you and me, let's say. So that's what I'm interested in, a relation defined over this product of spaces. Okay? So, what is the nested contours criterion? That's the criterion that we're going to implement. It says that Mr. I is better off than Mrs. J. Okay? When? Well, on the extended upper contour of Mr. I and the extended lower contour of Mr. J, they don't intersect. Okay? Or, again with the graph, this is Mr. I that you met before. This is Mr. J. Okay? Now we see that the extended upper contour of Mr. I and the extended lower contour of Mr. J, they don't intersect. Okay? That means that so that both individuals, they agree that any of the points that under a frame is preferred by Mr. I over his own bundle is indeed better than any point that under any frame is preferred by Mr. J. You see that? Okay?
So can you clarify the reference bundles? Are they arbitrary, or no, they must be...
Sorry,
I mean the bundles, because if you consider different bundles, then...
What they have.
That's what you have. So this is your health and your consumption.
Okay.
This is you, this is
so
me.
So it's for this bundle and that bundle.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So these are two people of the same health, but this is a rich person and that's a poor person. Okay, so
just because under these sort of funny scenarios that people are like, some people are just better at generating utility from their life circumstances. It could, of course, on such a story still be possible that we're in a circumstance like this, you and I, but I'm just so much better at generating utility from my life circumstances that I'm actually better off than you.
Exactly. So that's precisely, and I'm very happy that you ask clarification on that point, that's precisely what we rule out. So what nested contours is basically saying is that, well, I'm making interpersonal well-being comparisons based only on ordinal information.
Right.
How efficient you are in generating satisfaction, we don't care about that. Okay, you like that or you dislike it. I think the good argument to like that is to say, well, we don't want expensive tastes to kick in. Imagine that a person, and one of the persons is this person, right? But he or she is only happy when she has a Ferrari and drinks champagne every morning. So she's very miserable, right? She's a very inefficient pleasure generator, whereas he is much more efficient. We don't want that to kick in. So that's our value judgment that we're building. It's purely ordinal. You like that or you dislike it. Okay? Yes?
Why not just drop well-being then and say this is interpersonal comparison, for example, of an index of primary goods or of...
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure, I think that in an audience as this, probably it would have been better not to talk about well-being because it has connotations that I not necessarily want to build in. Okay? Well-being here for us, for me as I would say an applied welfare economist, what I want to, that measure, well-being is meant to be a measure in which I want to use to compare people to identify who is the worse off, in which I want to apply the Pigot-Dalton principle. Okay? Which you might not necessarily be willing to no, you may not want to call that well-being.
Okay, good. That's useful.
Yeah, thanks.
Will you say a bit more about the motivation for this? Will this still come, or is this the right moment to ask about it?
This is the right moment.
Good. So I'm not sure why this is the most plausible way of doing it. I mean, why not, for instance, just do a kind of frame by frame comparison? I mean,
yes. So one thing, what you could do that, but one thing we wanted to do in this paper is basically be as conservative as possible. Okay. So always stay. So remember what we want to do is we want to be able to take two people from the street and say in how many instances we can compare them. So I'm throughout the entire talk always taking the most conservative assumption, right? So indeed I can rank more if I would say that frame by frame. But of course your frames might not be my frames. So it might be very difficult to compare frame by frame. I might be framed by the weather, you might be framed by your social security number, and then it becomes very difficult. But always throughout this entire talk, I want to make as least as assumptions, at least as structured as possible. And here again, I want to be as conservative as possible and treat the upper contours, let's say in the most conservative sense, so that it is as big as, that the criteria is as, it's the hardest to satisfy the criteria.
so people who are particularly frameable are basically very difficult to compare.
Exactly. And that's precisely what we are empirically going to investigate. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So all we need to think with rain and shine is really, it may rain on you, but it may shine on me. We're not neighbors.
Yeah, that might, yes, it might be that, I mean, there is nothing, I mean, I didn't specify. So for me it might be rain and sun, but for you it might be...
It might be different student.
Which soccer team won, or
okay.
It might be something else.
Okay.
Or you might, so what behavioral economists, you might have more sophisticated models in mind where you have, Luc has in his head several personalities, right, several selves, and Luc only has an unambiguous choice for something when there's like an agreement among all his selves, right? So all his selves, they deliberate, and all the, sorry, Luc, take you for the example. When I have all my selves in my head and they all discuss and they negotiate and say, well, okay, we agree that this is really better, then we say that something is better.
You can measure this by response time, of course. If he doesn't respond, then they self are still negotiating.
That's another reason for celebrity.
Yes.
So what's important here is this sort of structure of kind of multi-sets of indifference curves, right? So, and then one interpretation of it is that they've been generated by these frames, but another might be that they're multiple selves. And another interpretation presumably be that it's uncertainty here. You just don't
and in fact, to be honest, the only thing we really need is that later on, my respondents will be able to say, really, I don't know.
Yeah.
This is too hard. So we need a structure that allows, in some instances, people to look at the problem and say, we are bored with your questionnaire. I mean, this is too hard. I mean, I don't know. There's something better on TV. I mean, something that people might say, I don't know. Okay, and we don't want to force them to make choices, and then again from this conservative perspective. Yes.
So you're allowing us, the philosophers, to come in and say what's health is important, consumption is important, but you're not allowing us, the philosophers, to say what is more important. You want the people to say what's more important.
Exactly.
But people can be people can be mistaken, right? I mean, it's an interesting normative choice, right? So Mr. J might be really, really healthy, right? But he doesn't care about health. All he wants is his Ferrari, and he doesn't care if he dies tomorrow.
Yes.
Mr. J could be worse, right, than Mr. I. And from a policy perspective, I mean, it's an interesting question whether we really want to give that kind of preference, that kind of weight, basically.
Yeah. So this is, to some extent, this is a very, very liberal
Yeah,
It's
well,
a
in
very-
some ways. Because you're not,
and you
allowing,
might
you're not
say-
allowing them to choose the dimensions.
Yes, well,
So it's like
that
this
is-
kind of mix. It's an
No,
interesting thing.
Yes, but if I really would, if I would have like an infinite research budget, then I would also basically allow this to be free, and then people are just free to say, look, I mean, these are dimensions that I give 0
Okay.
weight.
Okay.
Okay, so in that sense, I mean, allowing people to set the weights also solves the problem what is important, right? I mean, I take a super list, and some people in fact are doing that, some economists, you take a list of everything what a philosopher somewhere has mentioned, right? You have like 150 items, and then you allow people to give weights.
But I guess you don't feel like you need to justify your liberalism. Because, I mean, people can make mistakes, right? I mean,
Yes.
But we're just gonna...
Yes, so, well, the argument why so I think that your preferences is that what makes a person,
Okay.
right? And basically something like an argument like behind the veil of ignorance, that's only what you have, right? Is a view on the good life, right? Is an idea about what is important in life.
Well,
And I shouldn't have mentioned this. I know.
So it's okay. It's okay. I think it's a philosopher pointing out here are the normative assumptions, etc. So that's fine. That's fine. I just wanted to point out.
I'm putting on the table my liberal.
Great.
Yes. Okay. Very good. So that's where we are. So here is a case where we can rank the two individuals. Now look very carefully. The green guy changes his under a frame a little bit. His indifference curve, and here there is an intersection. So now we can not rank them anymore. Okay?
That's cool.
Okay, so what we do here is we make interpersonal comparisons that are consistent with their unambiguous choices. As we said, it's completely ordinal, but it, as we just have mentioned, right, is potentially very, very incomplete. Okay? So what do we want to do? We want to investigate how incomplete it is. And to do that, we're going to present a more complete version. A version of the action that we can gradually make more complete. How are we going to do that? We're going to define irrestricted nested contours. It's, as you can see, precisely the same, but we only consider intersections with this set E, which we call an evaluation set. Okay? And if the evaluation set would be the entire space, this and that are precisely the same, and the narrower the evaluation space becomes, the easier it is to fulfill this criteria. Okay, so what we can do now is I take two individuals, and I see how big does this evaluation space need to be for me to be able to rank them. Okay?
So if the evaluation space is limited to the individuals, their allocations, then this is a kind of UNV stuff.
Exactly. Yes, that's probably true. Yeah. Should think more careful about that, but that's probably true. Yeah. When the evaluation space would be a line, a monotone path, then basically, and all preferences would be complete, there is no non-comparable area, then I can rank all people. And that's basically what I have been doing with Mark and Erik when we talk about equivalent incomes. Okay? Just as a side remark. If this sounds like jargon, I mean, don't worry. I mean, this is how it connects to earlier work that we have been doing. Okay, again, the graph. So this is the case where I and J have their little intersection. So what are we doing? In our empirical application, we always start from this yellow line. Okay, this yellow line is the line with full health. This is again a normative choice. Okay? We start from the full health, right? Why we do that? That's because this is some kind of a benchmark case in the literature where people use, in fact, this yellow line as a monotone path. And they say, look, now we're going to compare these two areas. Right? That's what Mark Fleurbain and Erik Schokkaert have proposed in a paper in 2013. Okay? And if then indifference curves are complete, then you have a point and you can compare these 2 points. Okay? What are we going to do now? We start from there and we expand our evaluation space. Okay? So we see how far we can get, and we can get until there. So for these 2 people, I mean, we can compare them on this evaluation space. Of course, we could have chosen another sequence of evaluation spaces. We could, for instance, I mean, inspired by Deaton's Nobel Prize, we could take an array and then a cone which nicely extends. We have programmed that, but that is really a nightmare in terms of computational time that takes a week to give results.
So why is this making a difference, right? So Mr. J unambiguously agrees that Mr. I is better, right?
Mm-hmm.
No, why
there
not?
is a point here.
No, but compared to his bundle, right? When we're talking about where Mr. I is in terms of his bundle, why should Mr. J care about Mr. I's indifference curve?
Well, because there is a point here, and this point is in fact a point such that Mr. J, Mr. J says, this I am, let me think, I am worse than that point, and Mr. I am better than that point, and Mr. I says I'm worse than that point.
Mr. So J says, but again, from Mr. J's perspective, what Mr. J cares about is not Mr. I's indifference curves, right? What Mr. J cares about is where Mr. I actually is, right? I mean, it's very strange.
Well, yes, but this is, well, you could think that this is very strange and that what we are doing is way too weak. But if you...
I don't think it's too weak, I think it's sort of irrelevant to what people care about, right? I mean, so on this view, for some reason, I care about what you're in... I don't care about how well off you actually are relative to me. I somehow care about how your indifference curve, points on your indifference curves compared to how well off I am.
But I think I don't agree entirely with what you said before. I mean, to make the claim that that this person is worse than that one, what we don't want is that there is some hypothetical situation in between where the ranking is reversed. That is in between them. So let's say that I'm better off than you, and we don't want that there is a hypothetical situation in between us such that you are better off than that hypothetical situation. And that's it, the hypothetical situation considered by you. That hypothetical situation considered by me is worse. Right?
If this were a budget constraint, right, I would be much more on board, right? I would say, okay, so somewhere on Mr. I's curve, you can switch health to consumption to the point where Mr. J might care and be but these are just indifference curves. I just still don't see why Mr. J would care that somewhere on Mr. I's indifference curve. You're going to have to have a lot more motivation for me. I mean, again,
you won't want to switch goods with the other those particular bundles. But then the thought is, I suppose, there are all sorts of other bundles which are in some sense equal to the bundle he has, given indifference. But then, and I suppose there's some sort of transitivity assumption, and then you say, but then there's a case where these equally good bundles have this property of sort of switching over.
Yeah. Someone offers you all kinds of ways to walk up the curve. You will always switch the bundle, but at some point you reach an area where
something like that. Thanks.
Very strange.
It's a good question why you should care about it.
Yeah, very strange. Very strange.
The thing is, of course, you sort of put your I and your J in such a way that it's a little bit to the left. I mean, the thing is, they could just...
they can be whatever, right?
Right?
Exactly, they can be whatever.
That helps my point.
I know.
Okay.
It makes it tricky.
I totally agree with your colleague's argument.
Yeah.
That would be also my argument.
Because remember, you could think about this as if a policymaker was trying to was going to implement things, and they were going to give one person purple dots and the other person green dots, and then after that they could do their exchanges. You could do that, and then they do their exchanges, and they land up at a point where the ranking is reversed. So your policy is kind of undermined, as it were.
Exactly.
I was trying to make Kai better off than you, and then
that
you make all these changes, and he ends up.
That's what I'm saying. That requires that you be able to move.
So there are all these exchanges.
Exactly. But that requires a different setup, right? I mean, if you told me that you could move along the indifference curve, I would be okay. But I can't just randomly give up some consumption from what else if I'm sick.
There's no area, I think, in the framework where I excluded that you can change. So if you move along your indifference curve, from a well-being perspective, that is the same.
True.
So that is built in the machine, right?
I just don't see why Mr. J should care about Mr. I's potential hypothetical indifference curves when we're comparing.
Because, as Richard was saying, I mean, imagine that a policymaker could put both of the guys there,
Yeah.
on my finger, then the ranking is reversed.
True. True.
And then Mr. J said, but then I don't agree that Mr. Blue is better off. Whereas in the case where no such points exist. Right?
I'll see if.
Yeah. No, but that's important. Okay, but that's where we were. That's a theory. Okay, so that's a theory. So now I want to precisely do what I described. I take two people from the street and I implement and see how big the yellow area is. That's what I want to do. Okay? Of course, to do that, I have to know what are people's two difference curves. Right? And that's the tricky thing. Okay? So that's what I'm going to talk about now. So again, meet Mr. I. Now I'm going to describe the machine, basically, the survey machine, if you want, that we're going to use to draw the upper contour, the lower contour, the non-comparable sets of Mr. I. Okay? That's what we don't know. What is in dotted lines, that's what we don't observe, that's what we don't know. These are his indifference curves, and this is where his different selves don't agree, or whatever. And you see, right? So that is what I don't observe. So how am I going to proceed? To Mr. I, I'm going to ask Mr. I to make a comparison between his real life and hypothetical life. Okay? How am I going to construct a hypothetical one? Well, as follows. I start on this line with full health. Okay? And I'm going to ask Mr. I to compare his actual life with a life that is at full health and halfway the consumption. Okay, so now Mr. I looks at his two choices, and I'm going to be very precise later on how precisely we do that in our survey, but now we ask Mr. I to say, well, you have your blue situation, that's where you were. Imagine that the red one was possible for you. Would that be an improvement, yes or no? All the selves of Mr. I contemplate, and they agree, they say yes, because it's in his upper contour. They said, I unambiguously prefer the red point. Everybody sees that? Right? So, now that we know that the red point is unambiguously preferred by Mr. I over the blue one, what we can do now, we say, well, now we know that his indifference curve, or his thick indifference curve, his non-comparable set, is somewhere between my fingers. So I can half again. Okay? And that's what I do now. I half again. And I ask him again, now Mr. I, is the blue one better or the red one is better? And Mr. I thinks, and he says, now the blue one is better. Now I know, well, it must be somewhere in between these 2 points. And again I can half. That's why it's an adaptive, bisectional, dichotomous choice. Right? Me doesn't like this name so much. I try to see how you react, but not that much reaction. So that's what we do. It's a machine in which we always have basically the area where we know that the indifference curve must be. Okay? Until at some point we reach that point where the person says, well, I don't know. I mean, under one frame I would say the other thing, under the other frame I would say the other thing, or I just don't know. I mean, too difficult, too hard. These are really lives that are very close. I mean, I don't know. Okay? So that's what we do. So what we know is we know that the indifference curve must be somewhere between these 2 points. Now I take from my shelf one of the assumptions that I had on the preferences, namely that it is monotonic. And using that assumption, I know basically that this area for sure is in the upper contour, and that this area for sure is in the lower contour. And I don't know anything about these 2 areas. So my most conservative estimate about your upper contour will be everything which is above my finger, and my most conservative estimate about your extended lower contour is everything below this triangle, or the bluish and the white one. Okay? Yes?
Are you assuming that a person's judgment about whether he would prefer one hypothetical configuration to another is independent of his actual present configuration?
Not necessarily.
Because I can imagine a situation where it's between health and consumption. Somebody who's very sick is likely to say, I'd be willing to eat 1 meal a day if only I could get out of bed. And somebody who's only eating one meal a day is I'd give my right arm in order to be able to eat fully. Are you taking account of that sort of possibility?
Well, I can give two answers. One way it might be that in this hypothetical, in this comparison, people might be aware of that. That they say, look, I mean, if I compare to that situation where I would have no health problems at all, you take that preference into account, and then that's what you take into account when you talk about ambiguous and non-ambiguous choices. You might think of the preference in your healthy situation as one frame, and the preference that you have in your non-healthy situation as the other one. Okay, that would be one answer. This, of course, is very hard, and psychologists have said that this makes no sense. Okay, that people are basically not able to predict what their preferences would be in a health situation that they don't have. Note that we are asking unhealthy people to think about a healthy situation, which might be relatively easy because unhealthy people might be thinking about what it is not to be sick, rather than the other way around. But another way of doing that is to say, well, if you want to make a comparison about whether you would be better off in a healthy situation or in a non-healthy situation, given the fact that your preferences might be depending on that, you might be thinking of that intrapersonal comparison as an interpersonal comparison and apply the machinery that we're talking about here. In which case, in many cases, you will not be able to say anything. Okay, so I think that are the two possible tracks along which I can answer your question. Yes?
I think this is a stupid question, but I'm
No.
confused. Why? How do you draw the first thought, though? Why is it there and not further to the right, for example?
It's not at all a stupid question, because that will be the next point. Okay, so but we start by full health and operating along this line on full health. Now you think, well, I mean, we can in fact do more, precisely along the lines that you suggested. Why don't we do it also on this line? So why don't I do precisely the same thing on this line? So, and this line is defined as halfway between your current health and your full health. I do the same thing, right? Present a red dot and so on and so forth, halve it, and get a bound. And with these bounds, again, using monotonicity, I know much more. Okay? So we're going to do this at full health, at what we call intermediate health, which is halfway between your health and full health, and we're also going to do that up there. So we're going to do that with full consumption. We get bounds up, we can get more information, and we do that with intermediate consumption, and again we can get bounds. So that's what we know. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to present people let's say 4 sequences in full health, 4 sequences, 4 questions in intermediate health, 3 here and 3 there. Okay, so basically we're going to ask people 14 hypothetical choices. That's more or less what in discrete choice literature people can do. And then that's what we know about your indifference.
How have you managed to derive a ratio scale for health?
At this point, I don't need anything along these lines, right? This can be, I mean, I can rescale everything. I'm only using monotonicity.
Okay, all right. Okay. You said halfway. It doesn't matter to.
No, but I will come back to that point. I have to communicate very well what this. You're absolutely right. I should not have said halfway. Intermediate.
All right. Okay.
And we have to communicate, of course, very well what this intermediate level means. And I come back to that later. Okay. Now, leaving these points aside.
This intermediate level is going to be different for different people.
Say again?
This is going to be different for different
Absolutely.
people.
Absolutely. So where this line is and how we communicate with you, me as an interviewer and you as a respondent, that will be respondent specific, where this line is.
But then if you start comparing two sets of people at these particular points,
we're not going to compare we're not going to compare only at the points. I'm now going to say for Mr. Blue, the extended upper contour is this. And the extended lower contour is this.
Yes, that you can say for one individual.
And now I can do the same for another individual, and I can compare it, for instance, with that point.
Yeah, but if you say to person 1, suppose you were blind, what would your consumption look like? And if the blindness means something else to person 1 than to person 2, then you have a different you know, then you're looking at a different.
I mean, but I think that's a different.
health line, no?
That's
what you're saying, right?
But
Yes, but this particular intermediate point that you have over there for that individual, it has a certain meaning. And you're going to construct for another person also contour sets including that point, but it's not sure that this has the same meaning for this other person. So.
Wait, but we don't need that. Huh? We can. I mean, I'm going to use the entire contour, so I can compare me with this point from you, or that point from you. I'm going to use the entire contour, and not only this point. I have constructed the contour set based on the points, but then assuming that people are monotonic, I construct the entire contour set, and it's that contour set that I'm going to compare across people.
I don't know whether like different meaning might return to the point Richard raised. I mean, which is, I suppose, irrelevant, right? It could be that one person is much happier under these health states than the other person.
That is not. That I don't care at all.
Right. Yeah.
That is filtered out.
Right.
This is purely ordinal. I don't care at all about happiness. Dirk, I'm not sure that I respond to your question.
No, I have to think about it.
Okay, well, we come back to it. So, this is only assuming monotonicity. Now, if you want to take from the shelf convexity as well, you can get say much more. And in fact, you can get quite a narrow bound around your contour sets. Okay, that tool we're going to implement in a survey with real people. Okay, how much time do I still have?
You're doing fine, but it's 35 minutes or so.
Oh, great.
It's the questions.
Okay.
You don't have to set aside.
No,
questions
great.
we ask them.
Great. Last part. So we know we have a normative theory, right? Or a criterion. It's not a theory, a criterion. Okay. We have a tool that allows us to draw contours, and now I'm going to apply. I'm going to apply that with data that we have collected very recently. It's in fact the data were more or less collected from the moment that Trump took office. So this is really like, when we see that on TV every day, we're just counting the errors he made, like 3 weeks or 4 weeks ago. We did it. So let me be. So we did it in fact before. We did it last year, and Luc probably remembers when we were both in Princeton. I was very excited because I had collected the data the first time, and we made a couple of mistakes, but all the programs still work. So now we have done it again, and I will highlight where we have changed our survey with respect to the one that we did last year. So that's why we can have results after 3 weeks. Okay? So we did that very recently, and we basically, Qualtrics, that's a language in which you can have online surveys. It's a computer program that you can use to make these online surveys. If you get such an online survey from your bank, it's written in Qualtrics. Okay? So that's also what people in social sciences often use to make surveys, and they also have contracts with survey agencies who have panels of people. Okay, so we bought from them 2,500 respondents to our questionnaire. And from these 2,500 respondents, about 2,200, they are within the consumption bounds that we have set. Remember, I forgot to tell you, here you see maybe why we had to bound the consumption space, because we have to move on this horizontal line. Okay, and to be able to do that, we had a priori to set, what is this upper bound. Okay? So people who are too rich, we basically have to filter them out, and that's why we end up with 2,260. Also people who responded too quickly were filtered out because we don't trust them. Okay, so that's why we get 2,260 respondents. Note, this is not at all meant to be representative. This is just a sample from 2,260 people between 25 and 85. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the social demographics, about how we measure the health, coming back to some of the points that have been raised, say a little bit about consumption, and then how we have applied this ABDC method. Okay? So, this is the age distribution of our people for males, for females, and males. And then you see it looks roughly okay. But again, no claims of representativity. I'm making no claims whatsoever about representativity, because these are typically people who have volunteered to participate in these panels that are, that's not a representative sample of people, because you need a computer, you need time in front of a computer, and so on and so forth. Okay, but we have some old people as well, as you can see here. Okay, between 25 and 85 years old. Then, how do we measure health? Okay, now we come to the annoying details. I mean, how do you do that? How do you measure health? We measure health by what is called the short form 12 health survey, which is for health economists is like the shortest battery of questions that you can think of to measure the health outcomes of a person. It has 12 items. In fact, we use of these 12 items only 10. So we use 5 questions for emotional health and 5 questions for physical health. And now we come in a crude and primitive way to the point that Dirk was raising earlier, that health in itself is multidimensional. We here map it in the 2-dimensional space. So people answer to these 12 questions, and what people then see is on the screen, a bit like in a Women's magazine, you fill in the questionnaire, and then the computer tells you your emotional health on a scale between 0 and 100 is 86. Your physical health is 60. Okay? And then we ask people, now, given your preferences of this multidimensional notion of health, what kind of weight would you want to give to these two things? Most of the people, slightly more than 1/3, give a weight that is equal, but slightly more than 1/3 give also more weight to physical health. Okay, so based on that, we have a weighted average of these two numbers, and that is the health score for a person. That's what we're going to put on the horizontal axis. That's the distribution of the health scores. Okay, you see quite some people who are healthy, and then you see we have a distribution of health, and here are unhealthy people. Okay, so that's how we measure health. Right? Harder problem even, how are you measuring consumption? Because consumption, a lot of consumption in your family is going on at the household level. Right? So what are we doing? We're basically following a Dutch panel. That's the so-called LIS panel. That's a panel data that is going on in the Netherlands, and that has a module that many people are using to measure individual consumption. So how does that work? We ask your consumption, okay, for different items. For food, for transport, for utilities, and we ask that at your personal level, that you are consuming yourself, and at the household level, that you are consuming with your household. Okay? Yes? And then, on the household level, for some items, let's say food and transport, I'm asking you, what is your share in household consumption of food and transport? For instance, if you have a car that you have in your household, and you're driving with that car 3/4 of the time, you would save 3 out of 4. Okay? Now, what is your individual consumption? That's your personal consumption plus your share in the household consumption. Okay? And that's the measure of consumption. Okay? That's what we put on the other axis. That's the distribution of consumption. Okay? Looks reasonable, and then you see here, there's a bit of rich people that we have cut out. Okay? Okay, so that's consumption. That was health. So now we know for the people, we basically know their dot.
They've aggregated over consumption of different bundles, or...
Sorry?
I mean...
We just add they give that in monetary values.
Monetary values, okay.
And then we just add
that's the aggregation.
Exactly. So this is in dollars. And health is in a health scale measured between 0 and 100. And then we can do the machine. Then we can apply the machinery. So how does it look in practice? What we ask people, that's the screen that they get. So this is the person. Why are you guys laughing?
It's just a very kind of very bare bones way of like, here's your life. It doesn't look too impressive looking at that.
So this person, having 68 on emotional and 60 on physical life, has given equal weights, so gets 64 on health, has a consumption of 750. And remember what we do, we put you at full health and we halve consumption. And then what people do is say, well, what would you prefer? What would you unambiguously choose? Either this one, that one, or halfway. Okay? And people think about that, and some people take the box. I don't know. This is really too hard. The philosophers. This is impossible. I don't know. You cannot answer that question, and we allow it, right? I mean, that's possible. People can say that they don't want to do that. And in fact, we have. I mean, at the end of our questionnaire, I should have taken some of them because they're really funny. People are allowed to give comments. Okay? Some people, very few say that they found this really something they didn't want to do. They signed up to do something for marketing, and then they get this kind of questionnaire. what they don't want. But the large majority of people who give comments find this very interesting. They say, this is interesting, I never thought about my life in this way. I mean, I never thought about, I mean, this really, like people saying very emotional, very personal and emotional things in a comment survey. Okay, so that's what we do, okay? Now, I still promised you to tell you a bit more on how we communicate these health levels, this intermediate health levels. Okay? Communicating what it means, a health of 100% seems easy, right? Because that's no health problems. But how do you communicate a health level of 80? What does it mean? You are somewhere here, and now I tell you, later on I will ask you, 78. What does it mean? So what do? For each time we communicate a health level, we show at the bottom of the screen a description of what that health score would mean in terms of the questions that you have answered. Okay, so these are the 10 questions that you have answered, and we connect it back to possible answers that bring you to that health score. So people see basically that would mean that health level would mean that I cannot play bowling anymore, for instance one. So that, for instance, then if it would become, let's say, 80, that you become limited in moderate activities, such as moving a table, and so on and so forth.
So if a person has a score of 80%, all people with a score of 80%, they get the same list?
Exactly. They get the same.
Even though they have different ratings for physical problems and emotional problems?
No, the trick is that this, and he will correct me, these are things that bring you on 80 on both levels, and then the weights do not matter. We thought about that, huh? But this is really a bit of trial and error, reverse engineering our own health score and how to generate. So we have, of course, we don't have an infinity of vignettes, right? Because this is what's called a vignette. So we have a limited amount of vignettes that bring people in brackets around the levels. Yes.
There's something a bit bizarre in the way these questions are formulated. Take, say, the second one. During the last 4 weeks, as a result, should be of the absence of emotional problems you didn't contribute.
Yeah.
Or else you keep emotional problems and put the rest in the positive. You're making
No, I totally agree. And why this is the case is because this is a frame in which we change things, and this is a very bad example because it's 100%. So it becomes more sensible when some of these things become like really problems. But probably we were a bit...
But people have difficulty juggling with more than one negation.
Yes, well, that is true. That's in fact a good suggestion. Maybe we'll go back to the data because we try to stay as close to the questions as possible. We could do better on that. That's a very good point. Thanks for it. Okay, so that's how we communicate intermediate health. Yes, a question.
So, I don't know if this matters much, but I find it a bit odd that one question is about health and one is about consumption. If I saw that, I would immediately think. I know that's not how we're supposed to think, but I think some people might have thought like this, which is health, there's nothing you can do about it. If you have cancer, you have it. It's done. I mean, you can get treatment beyond you. While consumption, you can work harder or something. So I would have a tendency to go for 100% health, and then I thought, oh, then I'll rob a bank. You know, there's something.
I think what you say makes a lot of sense, but that is not how you should have read.
Exactly. I know, but I feel like maybe many people will read it like this. You should make very clear that that's the state where you're going to be, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yes, I think maybe we could have again. Yes, because in fact I was a bit sloppy when I took the screenshot. That's precisely what is above that, right? That we explain people that is really the state. But of course, I mean, people might. I really don't know what is going on in people, especially if you have to imagine. I mean, that's how I imagine. These are people sitting in front of the TV answering this questionnaire. So what is going on in their head is really not always very deep. But anyway, so here is the answer. So remember, there is halfway the answer, I don't know. So how many people choose I don't know? Okay, first question. So this is the first choice you make, and people make 14 choices. Okay, so you make 4 choices with full health, then 4 choices with intermediate health, 3 with full consumption, and 3 with intermediate consumption. Okay, so as people go through the process, you might think that they start to see how the machine works. So they get a bit familiarized, and that's why we expect that less people start giving I don't know. On the other hand, you might think that people at some point get bored and just click I don't know to get rid of the questions. And of course, gradually when you move on a line closer to your indifference curve, it becomes harder, right? Because these are really points that for you are very close to your indifference curve. So that's why we get this bit like saw shape that in the beginning people find it hard, then it becomes harder and harder because they move closer to their indifference curves, and then when we start all over again, it falls a bit because you say, we know these kind of questions, then it becomes harder again, and so on and so forth. Okay? I was expecting these to be a little bit higher, but well, you never know if you talk about it. If you work with real people, what happens? Yes?
Why don't you allow people to say that the options are equally good or on par?
Well, that is a very good question. And the answer to that question is that we started doing that, and we didn't have an I don't know, but we had these are equally good for us. But then people basically got on 2 on par points. And that is really hard because you cannot think of that. So we had some people who said that they were on par on several points. Somebody, for instance, says, I don't know, has like a really indifference curve, which is very thick. So that's why we moved to I don't know. In fact, probably technically it would have been better to have I don't know, and this is on a par. But this is really, really hard. In terms of the machinery, if you're on a par, whether you select left or right, that does not really matter. Okay, so we chase them. Yes, I think that is correct. I should think more about them. And this is a person. Okay, this is Mr. 100. Mr. 100 from our sample. What he has given as answers is this, that, and that. And this is how his real indifference curves look like. Okay, so if you only have monotonicity, that's this full line. This is, let's say, his most conservative estimate on his upper contour, most conservative estimate on his lower contour, and then if you're willing to impose convexity on as well, you can rule out this little triangle, that triangle, and that triangle. Okay, so that's a real person. That's the kind of answers we get. And if you look at such an indifference map, now, and that was something that we did not really expect, but that turned out to be quite fun to do, now you can basically go back to your assumptions on your indifference curves, on your preferences, and see how many people are in fact consistent with your assumptions. For instance, if that would be here, that would certainly be a person that's not monotonic. Okay, so that's what we do then, is to say, look, for each of these people, how many of the people are really monotonic? In fact, we can never know whether you're monotonic. The only thing I can do is reject at some point that you're monotonic. Okay, for instance, if this point would be here. Okay? So, in our data set, there is about 16% of the people for which we can reject that they're monotonic, and 10% for which we can reject that they're convex. And you might say, let me not talk about consistency, we can talk about that in the questions later on. And then you might say, is this a lot? Is this not a lot? I don't know. So then what we do is to say, well, why don't we take the common parametric assumptions that people make in the literature and see whether we can falsify them. And yes, so for instance, linear preferences are, for 99% of the people, they don't have linear preferences. Okay? Cobb-Douglas preferences, for 83% of the people, they don't have Cobb-Douglas preferences. If you allow any possible CES, constant elasticity of substitution preferences, 50% of the people cannot be, you cannot fit a CES utility function through the little gates that we have obtained. Still, you might be thinking, and I come to your questions then, Oh no, let me take that first, yes.
So I was just wondering, does monotonicity mean consistent but not monotonic? Or does it?
No, monotonicity means that we're always. So our test is also involving transitivity. So it's transitivity and monotonicity. So it's here, right? If you would be here, if these two would be here,
Yeah.
and then you can never be monotonic because there's no way that you're. Am I correct now? Now you want to make me doubt. This for sure cannot be convex because your indifference curve has to go up here, right? And if that point would be here, sorry, I was not correct. If that point was be here, then you cannot be monotonic, right? I mean, so that's how you can test.
Right.
But we also for each of these tests also need transitivity. So having a test of only transitivity, that's really hard because then you have to leave the framework in which you ask people to compare their own life with another life.
Yeah.
Then I would ask you to compare your life with another life and then another life with still another life.
So in these cases, you're sort of testing. You're saying on the assumption that they're transitive, are they monotonic?
Exactly. Can I reject that you are monotonic? That's what we do. Okay. So then you might say, yeah. But now imagine that there would be a monkey in front of your computer. And that monkey would just say randomly left, right, middle. I mean, how would he perform? Okay, that's what we do then. So we program a monkey, that's really easy. And then we chase a monkey through our questionnaire. And then you see that for a monkey we can reject to a much larger extent that these preferences, that these properties hold. So this gives us some reassurance that at least we are picking up something here. Okay? I'm not going to say much about that, but then we do some methodological checks as well. What happens if you, rather than 4, 4, 3, 3, you would only ask 3, 3, 2, 2. So you have 3 steps in the first, 3 in the next. We can reject slightly less, of course, because less power, the bounds are wider. And if we would not ask the 4 lines, but only 2, only the full health and full consumption, that's this case. Then, of course, you can never reject monotonicity. Okay, so that's what but these are, let's say, two checks, that are not incredibly relevant. Now, and that's where we, in fact, wanted to come to, right, is now we want to make interpersonal comparison. So this is, the blue person is Mr. 100, there is Mrs. 18, right? I think that guy is 35, she is 64, she is retired, and he is working but divorced. Okay? That's the fun thing about doing surveys. So, what can we say here? If you look at the constellation of indifference curves, in fact the yellow area is a complete space. Right? Because you see that the upper contour, the most conservative estimate of the upper contour and the most conservative estimate of the lower contour, they never intersect. Okay? So that was Mr. 18. Mr. 20, yeah, I forgot the details about it, Mr. or Mrs. 20, but you see here there is an intersection. So the yellow area only goes up to there. Okay, so what we do then next, and that's basically our computer that does that, is you take all pairs. So we have 2,000 people, we take all possible pairs, which is many pairs, and then for each of these pairs we see how big is the yellow area. And that's what we plot here. So there is, starting here, there is 60% of the pairs that we can rank only taking this very small line. The further you move to the right, the bigger the yellow area becomes. So this would be the full health equivalent income comparison of Mark Brevet. Okay? But note, people, of course, they have bounds. We don't have like a full point, so you cannot compare everybody. If the bounds intersect, we cannot compare people, so we have only 60% of the pairs that we can compare. Okay, and then as we gradually move to smaller up to larger yellow areas, we can compare less and less and less and less pairs until in the end we can compare 20 pairs. So in other words, if you're only willing to assume monotonicity, you take 2 people from our data set, there is 20% chance that you can basically we can rank them with the nested contours criteria. Okay? If you're willing to assume convexity on top, it gets a little bit higher, but not awfully much. Okay, so you can rank a little bit more because at some point you can cut some corners if you want. How would a monkey perform? That's how monkeys perform, so they do considerably less well than real people. And then these methodological choices, having less choices or wider bounds, gives us a little bit more power, as well as having these intermediate points. Okay? Then, and this is really the end, so what you could do then is you could see for each of the people now, how many persons are you dominating? Right? So for each of the person, you count basically how many people are you dominating. And then for each person you have a number, and then you can say, well, who are the people now with high numbers? Who are the people who are dominating many other people? It turns out that women do better than men. Okay? But what is I think more interesting to look at, we can basically compare the different ethnic groups. Okay? And then we find that white people outperform most other people, okay? Including also white people. And then Native Americans and the ones who score worse are blacks. Is at least in line with our, say, a priori about that. Okay, concluding, what we have done is we have investigated how you can make this, how we basically can implement this nested contours criterion with real data, how many people we can really rank, real people we can rank. Yes, and yes. Well, that's what we have done. Now I'm very